So for Nick Saban, it's now 3 national championships in 6 seasons. If you look at the national recruiting rankings each and every year, it should be, I would think, just about a national championship every year. This is the consensus #1 class. I know somebody out there, I think it was Rivals, said USC was #1, but I look at the positional ranks, and I just don't see anyone getting anywhere within this #1 class in Tuscaloosa. We bring in Ben George of Tide 99.1 to break down the Tide class. Ben, few surprises on Wednesday for the Tide. That's the way Nick Saban likes it. Everything was in order and seemed to be ready to go for him, and all the commits that were supposed to come in signed on the dotted line. So just kind of take us through National Signing Day, because despite this lack of surprises, still some storylines out there.
Yeah, first, Mark, thanks for having me back on again. But yeah, for Alabama, it was really one of the most drama-free days that I can remember. You know, usually you still have at least 1 or 2 big names that Alabama's trying to close on that final day. Wasn't the case this year. I mean, it seemed like everybody was in. We did a signing day special, right, from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. By the time that show ended at 9, I think there was only 3 guys left to send in their LOI. Those came shortly after. The only really surprises, or not really even surprises, but the only thing to follow on signing day for Alabama fans, Dalen Charlotte, the wide receiver out of Louisiana, he went ahead and reaffirmed. He committed early to Alabama, then decommitted, and then came back on and signed with the Crimson Tide. So that was a good pickup there. And then the other thing was Christian Bell, defensive end out of Hoover, who was a commit for about 9 or 10 months. He was asked to gray shirt, and he'll join the class next spring in January. He'll be a part of the 2016 class. A little surprising, mainly because Alabama only had 24 commits. They still had room for 1 more. So I don't know if Nick Saban has something else planned, if grades were an issue and they needed a semester to get it together, or he just wanted him to add some weight and get in shape so that he can come in and compete a year from now, because the defensive line is pretty strong for Alabama.
Like 65 or 70% of the top recruits in the nation, meaning the top couple hundred recruits, come from the footprint of the SEC, come from the Southeast and from Texas. Alabama could stay in the Southeast. They could stay within those 3 or 4 states and still probably haul in a top 5 class, if not a #1 class. But it's almost unfair, Ben, when they go to New Jersey and pull in one of the best cornerbacks in the country. They go to Washington, D.C., they go to Kentucky, which again is part of the SEC, but still Missouri and some other places, and still pull in some top talent. But probably the get that really jumps out, considering the quarterback situation and Blake Sims leaving, Blake Barnett in from Corona, California. So he gets away from the Pac-12 and USC and UCLA in particular, the #1 rated pocket passer. Jake Coker was supposed to be the guy last year, got beat out. You would expect him to be the front runner, but maybe Barnett's got a shot in year 1.
Yeah, it's possible. And Blake Barnett's recruitment was interesting because, you know, Alabama had Ricky Town committed for a while, who was one of the top quarterbacks in the country, who was at the time ranked the top quarterback in the state of California. He flipped, went to USC, and then shortly after, Nick Saban locked up Blake Barnett. Well, you fast forward 7 months later, Blake Barnett's the top-ranked quarterback in the country. Alabama bias, I don't know, Mark, some fans might say that, but he proved himself in the Elite 11 workouts and throughout the season, and he ended up being a 5-star and might even be the best recruit out of Alabama's class. And back at the time, it seemed like, well, maybe Alabama's just settling for the next guy because Ricky Town left. But Blake Barnett, you know, Nick Saban talked about in his press conference Wednesday that he's not against a true freshman starting at quarterback position, and that would be a reference to Blake Barnett. I mean, he's on campus now. He came in January, so he's working out. You probably saw him on some of the signing day coverage on ESPN as he made a couple appearances. The guy seems to really like the limelight. He's very active on social media. A lot of kids are, but he seems to be fairly grounded and seems to be kind of enjoying his spot. So, you know, I don't think it doesn't look like the pressure would be a huge thing for him right now. Look, I don't know the guy at all. I'm just going by what I've seen and kind of the things he says. But he looks like a guy that kind of welcomes that pressure in that big spot. So he'll be a big storyline entering spring practice, which is about a month away.
So based on your analysis of the 2014 version, transitioning to 2015, based on what you lose to the NFL draft, those positional needs where there's some gaps there, and what this class brings, which when I look at it, it's just about everything. It's pretty ridiculous. So, where are those positional strengths from this class that may transition and get some significant playing time for some of these kids next year?
Yeah, you're right. It is a well-rounded class. You know, you get a couple top running backs, top quarterback, but I think they really did well offensive line and secondary. Two positions they needed, especially secondary. We saw that was one of the weaknesses for Alabama last year. The offensive line, you have two guys that enroll early. Chance Warmack's brother Dallas, then Brandon Kennedy is another guy that comes in. Then I think even better, you have a guy that was in Tuscaloosa, Lester Cotton, one of the top recruits in the state. He'll come and play. Richie Pettibone out of D.C., one of the guys you referenced just a minute ago. He was Alabama's only parade All-American first-teamer. So I guess he's got a pretty good pedigree as well. And then Matt Womack, the guy's a three-star. I think he could be pretty solid. But then in the secondary, I think that's a spot where they got a lot better with guys like Minka Fitzpatrick, who looked like he might flip to Florida State. That was a little bit of the chatter getting close to signing day, but he went ahead and signed with Alabama. I think he can make an immediate impact. Kendall Sheffield might have been one of Bama's bigger gets. He committed at one of the All-American games, and most people didn't expect it to be Alabama. A guy out of Texas commits, and he'll make a big impact probably early on as well. Then you also have Ronnie Harrison out of Tallahassee and Deontay Thompson out of Texas. So they have a really strong secondary, and I wouldn't be surprised to see maybe one of these guys compete for a starting safety spot and a starting cornerback spot. They might not win it, but I think they'll be in the mix.
Ben, I'm looking at 16 players, as I counted up, that were ranked in the top 10 at their particular positions. It's just a wealth of riches. Again, 19 out of the ESPN 300. It's a strong class top to bottom, no question about it. I think it's pretty much an embarrassment of riches. One or two players that could be overlooked in comparison to the high fours and the five-star guys, maybe a couple guys that are back in that bottom of the basement, like ranked, like, I don't know, 15th at their position, that may surprise us. A couple guys that you like.
I'll give you one name, one guy that we had on this week. Keaton Anderson is a linebacker out of Alabama, Florence to be exact. And look, this guy, well spoken. He seemed to get it. Like you had a conversation with him. He wouldn't stop talking. I mean, he was outspoken, easy to talk to. I think he really gets it, and I think he's a guy that could be a Vinny Sunseri type player. He probably won't see the field year one, but year two or year three, he could be a guy that's starting at that linebacker spot for them. He's 6'1", 215, so he's not as tall as maybe some of the other guys that they run at that position, but I think he's got good solid size. And then I mentioned Matt Womack a minute ago. He's another three-star offensive lineman. Nick Saban got him to flip. I believe he was at Ole Miss, Mississippi State, one of the Mississippi schools. Got him to flip to Alabama. 6'7" kid, 320. He'll probably take a year to kind of get into shape, year or two. But I think he's a guy that also could be a solid offensive lineman, maybe even a 2-year starter.
I don't think there's any question that the rankings mean a whole lot. If you look at the teams that win and compete for national championships, they finish high in the rankings. There are some outliers of some really good programs like Wisconsin, Michigan State, TCU that do more with less. But Florida State, Ohio State, Alabama, LSU, across the board, a couple other schools in the SEC, USC, UCLA should be better in the next few years. I don't think there's any question. It translates because of the numbers, the sheer numbers. At the same time, you look at Super Bowl rosters, you look at NFL rosters, and you see guys, like a lot of guys that were like 2- and 3-star guys that make it all the way through the process, become impact players in college, and make it all the way to the NFL and have decent careers. The recruiting rankings, do you have any thoughts on the recruiting rankings, what they mean, if there's any bias in them? You kind of mentioned, I think, a little bit with a chuckle there, an Alabama bias, but if they're skewed at all, if there's any politics played into it in addition to just sheerly ranking and rating and evaluating football players?
I think you can take them all and kind of get an average. I think that's one good way to do it. But there's got to be some bias some places. Certain recruiting analysts have worked with certain coaches and schools more closely. They've established better relationship with those guys. And I wouldn't put it beyond a coach to really get a relationship with one of these guys in order to boost their class a little bit, in order to make their class look a little bit stronger. But I think, for the most part, these recruiting rankings are pretty accurate. They're going to miss on some guys. That's part of it. Coaches do that all the time. But a lot of guys don't develop until maybe their college year. So they go to these smaller schools, get better, get stronger, get bigger, and then they're in position to make an impact in the NFL. So, look, the top 10 guys, I mean, you're not going to usually miss on those top 10. I mean, I think those guys are legit, unless they have grade problems or, they can't handle the spotlight of the role. Those guys are freak athletes, right? So I think you gotta kind of agree with the overall general speaking, the actual rankings themselves. I think they're within a handful of spots either way, one way or the other. But you're talking the top 100, 150, those guys are all guys that can play at the highest level.
Yeah, at some point during the day, I checked out the top 25, top 30 players year to year, going back the last 3 or 4 years, and I was surprised. I think that the percentage of impact players and star players out of those top 25 to 30 players going back to like 2010, 2011 was much higher than you would even find in the NFL draft, where you would think that the known quantity or quality of these players would be much more of a science for these NFL scouts, looking at college players that play against known commodities and a pretty strong base of talent, and you can get a pretty good objective on where these guys stand versus rating high school players, where the play in Florida or Texas or California is completely different than somewhere in the Northeast or in certain states across the country. But I was very surprised at how closely that the rankings showed the individual player rankings were close to star players across the board, like 80-90% out of those top 25, 30 guys each year.
Yeah, these guys have gotten it down to a science. They have better access. There's more film on these guys than there ever has been. I mean, pretty much any player that plays football has a highlight film. Whether they're any good or not. I mean, their dad could put one together in a few minutes. So there's a lot more to analyze and break down. And I think that's resulted in better rankings. And the coaches are the same way. They have more access to evaluate these guys, so they get more offers, and that catches the attention of these recruiting services as well. So a lot goes into it. But yeah, these guys are good at what they do. I mean, and it's not an easy job, Mark. I mean, these guys are constantly on the phone. They're constantly trying to reach out to these kids. Usually weekends are one of their busiest times because these kids are in school. So it's not a fun job. I don't envy the recruiting analysts one bit. But I do think they do a very good job of what they do.
All right. Ben George, Tide 99.1. Appreciate the time, Ben. It's always a good talk.
Yeah, Mark, enjoyed it. We'll look to talk soon with spring practice right around the corner.